welcome to Destination I Do's podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Stein, and today we are talking all about keeping the peace as you plan your destination wedding. And I am joined by someone I'm kind of fangirling over, I'm not going to lie, Damali Peterman. She is a highly regarded and sought after lawyer, mediator, negotiator, educator, and speaker with nearly 20 years of experience in the alternative dispute resolution field. And she is the founder and CEO of two successful companies, and award-winning companies, Breakthrough ADR and Damali Law. And she is on the board of directors for the New York Peace Institute, one of the largest civilian peacekeeping centers in the nation, helping more than 10,000 people resolve their conflicts each year. I kind of need to be on that list, please. Damali, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for a wonderful and warm welcome. I will say that, unfortunately, I have cycled off the board of New York Peace. It's still an amazing organization. I am on the board and President's Leadership Council. I'm on the President's Leadership Council of an international peacekeeping entity, a powerhouse called Search for Common Ground. And I do have some other executive roles at other organizations now.
That's amazing. I mean, you have quite the resume. It's pretty impressive. So check her out for sure. And you're an author as well. Tell us a little bit about your book.
Certainly. My book actually will be released shortly. It's published by, in the US and Canada, Penguin Random House by their Putnam imprint. It's called Negotiating While Black, Be Who You Are to Get What You Want. My other publisher is Bonnier Books in the UK, and internationally, same book. Title is Be Who You Are to Get What You Want, and of course, translated in different languages.
Oh, I love that. I mean, the fact that you're in other languages, I mean, I can't imagine the editing job for that. I'd be like, I give up. I like that would be hard. So let's talk about conflict negotiation. And just a little sidebar. I went to ASU and went to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, and my favorite class that I took was conflict negotiation. It was like I went to every class. I didn't miss a single thing. Every lecture, I was like hanging on his every word. It is such a fascinating and important skill to learn. So I'm really excited for this episode because I feel like even though people go into their weddings and they think, they just have like just butterflies and rainbows and ideas of like it's going to be this perfect experience start to finish. And oftentimes it can be a bit of a minefield. There's a lot of emotions. Like there's two places I feel like in life that you start hitting some major conflict. One is when you get married, and one is when you have kids. All of a sudden, family can get a little nutso. Things can bubble up from their past, and it can be a bit of a minefield, like I said. So I'm really excited that you're going to help us kind of like navigate this. So, as many know, marriage is filled with compromise, and getting communication right from the start isn't easy for everyone. So, as a baseline, what are some good tips or practices for couples to communicate to begin kind of on a solid foundation?
I love this question so much because everyone always says you have to communicate, but no one tells you what to do. Like, tell me what to do. What should I do? And so the first thing that I'll say is oftentimes people, when they have an issue, either they want to bring it up immediately or they want to hold it. And sometimes we all know those people, maybe we are those people where you sort of are banking the issues. And then one day someone's washing dishes and then there's like this explosion, eruption, if you will, of you did this, you did that, you did this, you did that, like a laundry list of items. And the person washing the dishes is unsuspecting because they're like, all I did was, change the dish soap to a different brand and you're blowing up on me.
Right.
And so regardless of whether you're the person who immediately confronts an issue or the person who sort of stacks the issues, what's very important is to think about what the issue, what's underlying the issue. So what is the why, right? And so is it that you have a problem with something that the person is doing? Is it a behavior that you want to talk about? And what I tell people to do is and this comes from a lot of negotiation theory. So I'm not the first person to talk about this. You probably learned this in your negotiation course as well for conflict negotiation. But you have to sort of separate the person from the problem, right? So is your spouse being, a jerk, or is there something that they're doing that's getting under your skin? And if you can separate that, then you can focus on what the issue is. And then the next tip is to try to suggest, if you know what the solution is, or open the conversation to potential options. So something that I find to help couples, and not just couples, but just anyone. Like if I came to you and I said, you keep parking in my driveway and I can't I can't access my driveway because you're not parking in it, but basically slightly blocking me. And if I just said that, I'm just complaining. But if I then say, if you could just move 5 inches over to the right, which is a potential solution, then that's what I need. So sometimes if you propose a solution, then you can have a discussion, and the discussion can focus on those potential options. So one, try to figure out the underlying reason that you have this issue, separating that person from the problem. Two, if you can identify the problem, take the additional step to propose a solution. And even if that solution isn't accepted in full or in part, at least you can start a dialogue. Well, can you suggest something else? If that doesn't work, I just kind of want us to start talking about it. And then you go from being on two separate sides of an issue to being on the same side.
I love that. And I think there's such a foundation of positivity too when people are solution based versus just complaining. I mean, think about it.
Yes.
When we are at work, it's like I always feel like if it's no news, it's good news, right? Like that's literally what it feels like sometimes, especially as an entrepreneur. And it is hard when you just hear nothing but complaining with absolutely no solution. You start kind of feeling pounded on. And I can imagine in a marriage, especially, or the engagement period would be a lot of that, right? Like there's a lot of stuff bubbling up that maybe you didn't even know is there. And if you're coming I love the you get out of my parking space versus could you move 5 inches to the right? Like
Yeah.
that literally is such a small thing, but huge when it comes to negotiating what's going to serve everyone best. I love that. What's your feel on premarital counseling? Do you think it's necessary? And if so, how would you suggest they go about finding a person to work with? And like, do you feel like there's any, I know this is a complex compound question, but do you feel like there are any pros or cons to doing premarital counseling?
So I like that question because I'll tell you that when I got married, in order for the Reverend to marry us, premarital counseling was required before she would marry us. And so I know that some people just have that approach in general, where they want to have a few sessions with the betrothed couple before they say, okay, I'll be the one to perform the ceremony. And so in general, like my personal experience aside, what I've seen is that premarital counseling can really help. And I want people, sometimes when you hear the word counseling, it could take you to different places, right? What I want people to think about is, here's the analogy. If you are on a team and you're about to prepare for, let's call it, and I know marriage isn't a game, but just follow this analogy with me for a moment. You would want to go into it prepared, right? You would want to have some practices. You may want to have some practice games. You may want to kind of think about what you would do for different scenarios. You mentioned earlier that two of the things that can bring or introduce conflict into a relationship include when you introduce marriage or planning for a wedding, or when you introduce children into the mix, right? Or any caregiving responsibilities. I would expand it to that, right? And so for premarital counseling, I see it as something that can be helpful to prepare for something else. Just as if you want to play the piano in a recital, you wouldn't just say, okay, I'm going to play, Beethoven. You would actually prepare. And someone would help you prepare, oftentimes someone who has experience in that field. So I'm trying to, to the extent there is any stigma associated with it, I'm trying to destigmatize it a bit so that people know that if you see it as something that you do to prepare, right? To have the odds in your favor. And the fact that conflict is inevitable. I don't care what anyone says. I don't care how happy they appear on the outside or on TV or in the newspaper. There's always going to be some conflict that arises, and knowing what to do, or at a minimum, knowing what not to do, can be very helpful.
Yeah, I agree completely. And you're so right. There's such a stigma around the word counseling. And I think oftentimes, if someone maybe has tried it in the past for their own personal reasons and they didn't find the right counselor, they just dismiss it, they just write it off. And, to be honest, I also had to have premarital counseling because our minister was like, nope, not marrying you unless we go through this. And my husband at the time was like, he'd never done anything like that. And he was really, really nervous. And I think once we got in there and he realized, oh, this is like a coach, like you were saying, it's like a coach who's sitting by, all they want is for your best. They have your best interest at heart. And they want to talk you through and walk you through some of the potential major conflicts that can break a couple up.
Mhm.
Finances are one, child
Yeah.
rearing is another. There's so many things that, add to the divorce level, especially in our country. And if you can kind of have some safeguards and just really solid communication on the front end, and you can also build on some of the tools sometimes these premarital counselors can give you. So I totally agree with you. I think it's a really wonderful and important step to take. And, we invest so much in our finances, in our educations, and all of these things, but you don't see that same level of investment and time when it comes to a marriage. And until things really bubble up to the point where it's like, are we sticking in this or not? That's oftentimes when people actually seek counseling. And sometimes it's good to just have some foundational tools and communication, rules even, and to really be able to make that a solid foundation. Go ahead.
And what I would add to that, because I like what both of us are talking about, are two things. One, normalizing this step of premarital counseling, right?
Yeah.
It is not unusual. It's something that we should be normalized and a part of the marriage journey, right? Journey to marriage. And it doesn't have to stop there. It's something that could also continue post, nuptials, right?
Mhm.
And so I think we're doing that, which I love that, by the way, Jennifer. And then two, I think what we're also doing is saying that they're tools that will help you in their times of need.
Mhm.
And when you're getting married, you're thinking of all the great things, right?
Mhm.
Like you're thinking of, the wedding cake, the wedding dress, the party, all that stuff, living together, or whatever it is, like whatever you envision when you envision marriage or married life. And the reality is that, it's not always, I don't know, rainbows and lollipops. I don't know what the sayings are. It's not always those things. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of talk about those two things separately, because
Mhm.
normalizing it, I think, is important. We're in 2024. Let's just make that a part of what
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. Now, when a couple can't agree on something major around the wedding, and since we're a destination wedding themed product, what if they can't agree on the destination? What little bits of advice do you have in your pocket to help these couples out as far as getting to the destination and agreeing or compromising or whatever?
This is such a great question, because the way that this typically arises is someone says, I don't want X, right?
Mm,
And so the next question should always be, and sometimes why can trigger a defensive response.
yeah.
So even though what I'm getting at is basically a why, what I want to advise people to do is to say, tell me more, right?
Mm,
Or help me to understand why, where you're coming from. So
mhm,
just moving why over a bit. Um, because then with the why, you can have a better understanding of, is it, for example, is it the destination? Is it you're thinking about an elderly parent or grandparent who can't travel, so thereby would not be able to attend?
mhm,
Is it you're worried about finances? And so oftentimes people make these positional statements, and it's hard to negotiate when you're negotiating at a positional level.
Mhm.
I want X is either usually people see it as a zero sum game, right? So you
Mhm.
get this or you don't get it.
Right.
So my advice is to find out what's pushing that or driving that thought, that sentiment. And then if you can identify what it is, that's where you can see if there's any overlap, right? If there, oh, or even creativity, right? So okay, you don't want, it's not that you don't want a destination wedding. You don't want to go to this part of town. You don't want to do this particular thing. So it's something that's more akin to joint problem solving, and developing that skill as a couple is essential. And so the sooner you start exercising that muscle, the better you're going to be at it. And the more you practice, the better you're going to be at it.
Oh, I love that. I love that so much. That is amazing advice. Okay, listener, you might have to repeat this podcast and like take notes because Molly, you got some good stuff. Okay, in-laws. This is a tricky this is a tricky situation for a lot of people. I'm lucky in the sense that both of my sets of in-laws are pretty awesome. My husband would agree that he pretty much loves my parents and we all get along really well. And we're lucky because my parents get along with his parents. And so when we do holidays and things like that, it's easy. We're not going from house to house to house. Everyone's just together. That is rare. That I don't think that that is a normal situation. And I think one thing that couples forget is you're marrying this person, but you're also marrying their entire family. Or at least it can feel that way sometimes. So this can also be the source of stress for a lot of couples. And although we can't always control the behaviors of others, do you have any tips for engaged couples when it comes to navigating in-laws? Maybe they're pushing their agenda on the wedding itself or living like where you're going to live, after you get married, that kind of thing. What tricks do you have to help navigate that?
Well, I like how you started with I don't have this problem. I love my in-law.
Yeah, in
I would
case they listen, they'll be like, "Hey, no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I love you guys. I really do."
I love it. You started that way. That's what I would call like a legal disclaimer, right? Like just making sure we're not talking about me, but and I would and I'm teasing you because I am about to say the exact same thing, which is I have amazing in-laws. They're phenomenal. They call me daughter in love as opposed to daughter-in-law.
Oh,
Like
that's
we
so
have a
cute.
great relationship. And so but I know that's not always the case. And sometimes, people can start, polar opposites and grow together. Sometimes the um, having grandkids kind of do that for some families. Sometimes there are a lot of things that cause for conflict. Oftentimes the dynamics between your fiance and their parent can impact the way you interact with them. So if you see that they are somewhat estranged, then maybe you will kind of treat them or work with them at a distance. So there are a lot of different factors that impact the way one engages with their in-laws. And so I say that to say that there isn't one answer to that question. That being said, there are some things that we can do that can help us communicate with in-laws. In-laws when there's no problem. I was going to say drama, and I went with problem or issue or conflict. And then when you are in conflict. And so the first thing that I would say is there's a difference between, what people call the golden rule, which is treat people the way you want to be treated, which I believe in 100%. You should treat people the way that you want them to treat you. The difference between that and what I often see in many conflicts, most conflicts, so not just conflicts with in-laws, is I would have done X if I were in that position. So that person on the other side should do that too. That's not the way that things work.
Mm-mm.
Everyone has a different conflict response style. And so, yeah, maybe if you were the mother-in-law, you would have handled it this way, but you're not. That is a different person and they're handling it in their way. So I want to first say, just take that impediment out of the picture because that makes it harder to kind of bridge the gap if you have to then overcome if that were me, I would have done X. The real question is, why did this person do X, right?
Mm,
Is it about me at all? Right? Sometimes there are things going on that you have no understanding or awareness of that may have nothing to do with any personal dynamics between you and your in-law. And so the first question is this really about me or is it about something else? Something else that comes up a lot in weddings, the financial component, right? And so oftentimes, you're like, mm-hmm.
oh yeah,
So,
that's a meaty
right?
one. Yeah.
That's a super meaty one because
Yeah.
if parents or in-laws, whomever they may be, it's not always parents, right? You could be a step parent or what have you. Um, when there is a financial component, sometimes that comes along with expectations. Sometimes that comes along with, I would say, expectations of more say, control, etc. And depending on what the dynamics were before this, that could also come into play. And then there are other things that could be, influencing the interactions. Your sister, when she got married, she let me plan everything. Why aren't you letting me plan everything? Or this is the wedding I always wanted. I'm going to do that for you. So there's so many things that could be at play, Jennifer, that, I think, the main takeaways I hope that are clear are understanding where someone is coming from and trying to have that conversation. And by the way, it may be that you're not the right person to have that conversation,
Yeah.
right? Because there's so many cultural things that go into weddings. I mean, cultural, sometimes religious, societal, there's so many things. And so maybe your spouse or your future spouse should be having that conversation.
Mm.
Maybe your wedding planner, that's another thing. That's one of my
God, love
recommendations.
a wedding planner.
Right. Even if you have a day of person,
Yeah.
even, I mean, it's that person, let that person, you'll never see them again. They'll never see them again. Let that person get in the middle. Let that person be the bad guy, right? Let that person be the one to say, I understand, Mr. Smith, that you guys wanted to invite 20 of your friends to the wedding, but we just can't accommodate that many people. Yeah, you can talk to your daughter about it, but I'm looking at the list right here. I'm looking at the space, and we just can't accommodate them. Is there another way that we can make them a part of the ceremony? Right. And so oftentimes they have conflict resolution skills. They do this as their jobs, and they may have some ideas for you.
Hmm.
And they know how to navigate, familial drama. I would say not just focused on in-laws. So
Yeah.
that's a very long way to say, understand the why, try to get behind it and understand where they're coming from, determine whether you're the right person to have that conversation, understanding that sometimes certain financial support comes with some expectations and trying to understand whether or not you can deal with that for whatever that short period of time is between that date of receiving that support and your wedding. And then finally, having someone else be the intermediary, a wedding planner, so that you can collectively be mad at that person. No, no, no. You can collectively use that person as the one to sort of say some of the things that you may be uncomfortable saying for a variety of reasons.
I really love that because wedding planners, they've seen it all. They have
Uh-huh.
seen it all. And oftentimes they've worked with different types of cultures and, collaborations of cultures and things of that nature. And I think you're absolutely right to have someone who's like a third party to maybe come in and diffuse the bomb, if you will. That can be really helpful. I actually had a situation at a wedding I was in where the mother of the bride was just having a meltdown about the bride's hair and what she'd chosen to do. And she was having a meltdown about the flowers and she was having a meltdown. She was just having a meltdown. And I hate to say it, it's usually one of the moms that's because I do think weddings can trigger like what didn't happen in their life or
Yes.
like stuff bubbles up in all of us, right? And so I was literally watching this play out, and the wedding planner came in and just handled it. It was literally, I wish I had it on video because she came in and she was respectful, but she was firm. And she was, she just was really lovely. And it was interesting because I watched the bride kind of like her um nonverbal. I mean, she was just like hunched in and like almost
Mhm.
like apologizing for herself, and then I watched this whole thing play out with the wedding planner, and it was like it gave the bride some boldness and like, yeah, this is how I want my hair, and this is how I'm happy that these are the way the flowers look. And it was really interesting because it was like someone spoke up for her.
Mhm.
And I don't know that that's happened many times. And honestly, it really, it did, it solved the problem. And so I love that you're giving that advice because I've seen it play out myself firsthand, and it's really genius. And also, I think understanding the why, because when you know someone's story and you
Hmm.
understand like where they're coming from, sometimes your own expectation or frustration with that person minimizes because you're like, you have empathy for them. You're like, oh, well, if I'd known that, then I wouldn't have blown off the handle. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think the why, and that's across the board. That's with your in-laws, with your spouse, with, your best friend, whatever. If you know the underlying reason that they're digging their heels in or whatever, I think that really can be eye-opening and helpful. Okay, another big stressor for couples is the wedding party. There's a lot of personalities in the room. Sometimes these are friends that don't know each other. And so it's like a collision of worlds. Maybe it's like old childhood friends with new work friends that don't have, any baseline foundational friendship on their own. Sometimes it's, family members who you feel you have to check the box to include them, and you're not really that close with them, but they've got to be there. And then they're being selfish and acting like it's their day. And there's so many um, minefields with this one. Is it ever okay to fire a person out of your wedding party? And if so, like what situations would warrant such a step?
Absolutely yes, 100%. 100% yes. As just a principle, no one should be there who is going to bring you angst or agita or anxiety, or I have a whole list of A words. I can keep going with just A words. Um, so I do think that I know firing sounds harsh,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, you got to think about a couple of things. Your wedding is one day, right? But it's a very important day. And there's so many things that are outside of your control. At the same time, there are many things that are well within your control. And so I usually like to focus people on what can I control?
Mm,
Because, you know, some people and how they are, and they aren't going to change just because you're getting married and it's your wedding day.
yeah.
And so I've seen many creative ways to address that. And this is slightly different than with the question you're asking me. I realize that I'm going to also shift into that question. But if you can't accommodate all personalities together on the wedding day, consider having like something at your house or at a local place and, for those people, right? So a celebration, saying you're having a smaller wedding, whatever it is, just think about a way if you want to include them. There are many creative ways to do that. Before, I think, and I'm using the word before without giving a pinpoint in time period. I also recognize people get married all over the world, and so they're different cultures. Some weddings are multiple days. For us in the US, oftentimes our wedding day is a wedding day. But I know I've been to weddings where there were multiple days, and those were awesome. But in terms of firing someone, the reason that I started where I started is, to me, there are some options that you have, just like you do at your job, oftentimes, before you fire someone. Now, I'm not talking about whether someone's an at-will employee. I'm talking about, like, if you think about like disciplinary actions, maybe there's a warning, then there's a meeting, like there's something that happens. And so the first thing I'll say is, before you get to the point when you have to fire someone, think very long and hard about who should comprise your wedding party. If
Mm,
someone has caused drama in the last 4 weddings you went to, but they were your best friend in high school, and you always vowed that they would be your maid of honor. But over the last 15 years, this person has had a very problematic personality. Maybe this isn't the time to see if they're going to be different because it's your wedding, right? Like, I feel like you have to be very thoughtful, and maybe the way that you envision your wedding might be somewhat different because you know that this is a potential issue. So one, being thoughtful about who you decide to make up your wedding party. Two, give everyone a job. Sometimes conflict arises not just because of personality differences and, because you met these people at different stages in your life or different phases in your life, but because people are, all doing the same jobs, they don't know what to do. Maybe it's an uneven balance, and that is basically, just a team, right? So going back to the team analogy, everyone may play a different position, give them a role, and make sure they can handle their role. Because the question is, what is a fireable offense, right? Like, what would someone have to do to be fired? Well, one, something that's disgraceful, right? Two, not doing something that is important to be done before the wedding or during the wedding. Hopefully you don't have to fire someone when you're on the wedding day.
That would
And
be
then
awful.
three, if you are worried about, what will happen if you mix, for example, this person and alcohol, there are things you can do to sort of mitigate your exposure or risk in terms of someone becoming inebriated and, causing a scene at your wedding. That's not just limited to the wedding party. Maybe there's also, the first statement I said was, don't have anyone as a part of it that shouldn't be a part of it. Same thing goes for guests. If there's someone who you are going to worry about all night or all day on your wedding day, query whether that person should be in attendance. And I know this sounds like a very harsh stance, but
No,
some conflict can be
love it.
avoided, right, Jennifer?
Yeah. Absolutely. Especially with alcohol. I think alcohol is one of those things that, I mean, you look at back in the day when everyone in corporations were having these, end of year parties, and the next thing you know, HR's phones are blowing up because somebody acted inappropriately or said something, some offhanded comment or whatever. There's a reason, like, alcohol brings out sometimes the best in people and sometimes the worst in people. And I think those that are, and you can also, I think, in those situations, work with your venue to identify if someone, maybe you can't cut them off your list, but you know that they have a problem with alcohol and they might cause a scene. Maybe just give the heads up to someone and just say, hey, this person has a tendency to get overserved, just FYI, like, please, because they don't want that. That's a liability for them too,
Yeah.
to have someone who's just, going to be popping off. So, nobody wants that. Well, I love this. This is so great. I'm going to take a quick commercial break. And when we get back, we're going to start talking a little bit more about the destination itself and budgets and really meaty information. So hang tight.
Are you looking for the perfect vendors to make your wedding dreams come true? Well, luckily, Destination I Do has our very own vendor directory. From our homepage, simply click Find a Vendor, scroll down and choose your filters, and learn more about the vendor. You can view their recent work, click on their website, or even find their contact information at the bottom. We personally vet all of our vendors, so you can stop scrolling and just go to destinationido.com/find-a-vendor.
We are back with Damali Peterman, and we are talking all about keeping the peace at your destination wedding. So one of the things that has become a pretty regular, I don't know if it's a complaint, but it happened to me when I planned my destination wedding. And mine was planned almost 20 years ago. So I understand this frustration back then, because it was destination weddings just weren't happening very often. But a lot of couples are getting kind of some backlash about guests saying that their decision to do a destination wedding is selfish. How could you possibly ask me to take time off of work? Or the cost is so much more than if I had to drive 10 miles down the street to attend your wedding. So, what do you suggest the couple does to kind of keep a positive outlook and to handle the guests that feel this way?
Hmm. I think informing people as soon as possible is
Mm.
helpful.
Okay.
And on the one hand, I think when it's your wedding, it's appropriate to be a little bit selfish, right? Because
Okay.
it's for you and it should be based on what you want and you envision and where you want to go and what you want the memory to be. And
Mm,
so, on the one hand, I think that that is your right as people getting married. And on the other hand, I also think that that will impact who can make it.
mhm,
Maybe that was intentional. Maybe part of, the analysis for deciding to have a wedding, at a destination wedding was because, that's one way to deal with, that person who causes problems. They never travel. So we have it there. I can invite them, but I know that they won't go.
yes.
So I think to deal with people who find it burdensome or it presents a conflict or whatever the issue that could arise, I think there are a few ways to deal with it. One, providing as much notice as possible and making sure that people know that, you know, it's like this balance. It's what you've always wanted or what you want now. And maybe you woke up that morning and was like, hey, Aruba looks great. Let's have it there. Um, and that it's important for them to be a part of it, but you understand if for whatever reason it doesn't work out. And I think that's important because oftentimes there's some people who will tell you when they're having a hard time or struggling or,
Mhm,
and there are people who won't, and they'll just try to make it work. But then some resentment could be building, that comes out in ways that you can't anticipate because you don't know what's going on.
mhm,
So I think encouraging dialogue afterwards is important, and at the same time, it's like, well, do you really care? So it's like, you
mhm,
still want to have it where you want to have it. Is it going to change where you're going to have it? Or maybe is it something that, there's I'm just sort of thinking of different ways it can be addressed based on the conflict that I've seen arise. And some of the common things that come up for destination wedding are I can't take the time off or the date doesn't work.
mhm,
Okay. Another thing that comes up, I can't afford it, right? I can't afford it. Another things that comes up is, well, I was planning to do X and now instead of doing that, I'm going to be at your wedding, right? So
mhm.
and that's something people don't often say to you, but they may say it to someone else.
Yeah.
And so these are kind of the common conflicts that arise. Or it's too far, it could be, why can't we have it where your sister got married, right? So some of these types of things. And so of course, it depends. It depends what the issue is. So again, getting under that sort of, if you're thinking about conflict and you have the visual analogy of an iceberg, and the tip of the iceberg is what they're telling you, oh, I think it's going to be hard to go, or don't think I can make it. If you want to go under that water line and understand why, tell me more about that. We thought it would be great to have you there. Tell me more about that. Oh, because it's going to be, I can't take off. It's the busiest time. I'm an accountant in the US and everything is due April 15th and your wedding is that weekend. And I just know that I won't be able to do it. Okay, that's something you can't fix, right? Like that's
Right.
something that you have to spin your wheels on fixing. But if someone says, I'm not sure I can afford it, maybe there's some other ways to do it. Maybe you can say, oh, they have cabinas there that sleep 6 people. You like Marsha, Greg, Bobby, who are all the Brady Bunch? You like all of these people. Would you want to perhaps share a cabana together or a cabin together, and that would defray costs? So again, understanding what it is
Yeah.
that's creating the conflict will help you address it if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think too, like when I always live my life by the idea of if someone doesn't want to be there, then I don't want them to be there because there's nothing worse than obligations,
Oh yeah.
and sometimes there's obligations you have no choice but to face up to. But especially something like that, if someone is really pushing back and they're like, I don't want to spend the money, this isn't, do you really want them there? Like, do you really want it? To me, it's like if they're going freely and they're the other thing I've noticed is a lot of people, because it happened to me where and God rest her soul, it was actually my grandmother, who was not thrilled about the idea of a destination wedding. And ironically, she had to travel no matter what. If she was coming to my hometown or she was going anywhere else, she was having to travel. But for some reason, it was just in her mind. She was from a different generation. And she was like, wait, what? Why would you do such a thing? And the interesting thing is by the middle of and I explained to her, Grandma, I totally understand if, I mean, I would be heartbroken, but I would understand if it's too much or, it's just I don't want to ask you to do something you're not comfortable doing. But then halfway through, we were there for a whole week. She chose to come for the entire week. Halfway through the trip, she goes, I get it now. This is so much fun. It's like a family reunion mixed in with a vacation, mixed in with a
Mhm.
friend reunion. And we came up with the moniker the combo burrito because it was like all the things and I'm from Arizona, so like we eat a lot of burritos around here and tacos and all the things and we love them. But it was just funny because the one person who had the hardest time with it was the one who was by the end of it, she was like singing the praises. And she went out of her way to be like, not I'm sorry that I pushed back, but I get it now. Like I understand why this was important for you to do. So
Mhm.
I really love that. So now let's talk about budget.
Mm.
There's some meat on the bones here, and there's a lot to unpack. And budget is usually the number one point of contention at some point in the planning. So couples, sometimes we're seeing more and more couples that they're paying entirely for the wedding. Then there's times where they're paying for a portion and then their parents are paying for another portion. Sometimes the parents are footing the bill for the entire thing. So when it comes to disagreements over what to like either the amount itself or how much we want to budget for this or do we want to include that because I don't know like when I look at weddings nowadays there are so many elements there's no end to the money you can spend, there's no end to the vendors you can bring in. I mean, I've seen live animals, I've seen prosecco vans, I mean drone shows, you name it, I've seen it. So, how do you suggest a couple compromise within their own relationship and how to spend that money or how much to allocate for it? And then, second to that, how do you suggest they handle the parents?
I think putting things into proverbial buckets will help them to see what they want and what they need. And so, I like to think of three buckets, like minimal. So, to get married, this is what we need. Do you need do you need a marriage license? Do you need someone to marry you? Do you need a venue? Right? Whatever it is, like that, like the smallest bucket. The next bucket is, what would make it better, right? So
Mhm,
what are some other things that I want? What would make it better? And then the third bucket could be my ideal wedding, right?
mhm.
And what you might find is that there may be some variance between those buckets. And I know buckets doesn't sound like a romantic
I
term,
love it. I love a
but
bucket.
yeah, right. So
I like
essentially,
organization.
yeah, organization, whatever you can envision. Like I just see like three levels. And I say that for a couple of reasons. It doesn't only sometimes you see people have different emotional reactions during the wedding planning, right? Oh, what do you mean I can't get azaleas? It may not be azalea season there or anywhere. And so once you figure out what you must what the minimal is, maybe even that is, flowers. And maybe the flowers are different flowers. So for example, the three buckets can be three different types of flowers that, if you had your pick of any flower in the world, your ideal vision, then maybe that is, I don't know what a very expensive flower is, but whatever that is. And then you have like the secondary option and then that sort of tertiary option. And this helps you because again, if there's anything you can't get, you have options that you've already considered. I
Mhm,
like to plan for different contingencies. Venues, I know a venue that people chose a lot and that venue had a flood and they had to shut down. Nobody saw that coming. You had people locked it in because
mhm,
they paid and reserved it. And no one saw COVID coming, right? So there are all these things that could occur that you don't have any control over. So
yeah,
this goes back to what can you control? So I think having a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C is very helpful because you know what to do for the what if.
mhm,
I think also with budgets, to avoid conflict with your spouse or pretend your fiance or whatever term you want to use.
Yeah.
I think some open conversations about the budget. I think things always go over budget, and always, I don't usually like to use absolutes, but
Right.
it is rare that in almost any for different weddings for a variety of reasons, like supplies increase, labor increases, things just tend to go up. If you've locked in the rate or price, that's different. But if you're getting married, some people plan 2 years, several years in advance, some things could have changed along the way. And oftentimes some of those contracts that you've signed, in the fine print say that, yeah, you might be trying to lock in a plate of food per person at 160, but to the extent there are increases, then that they're going to pass that cost through to you 2 years later. So that there's, inflation for everything. So I think just always planning for more, meaning building in a cushion into your budget. And so if your budget is 100, I'm just throwing out a number. If it's $100, I would, whatever you can add, and that, just not to be like a tax or finance person, but say 20% more, or budget for 30% more, or whatever number gives you comfort. It could be 100% more, gives you comfort, so that you know that you are prepared for the what ifs. And then when it comes to parents, there's never an easy answer for that, because there's so many different dynamics at play. And without having had an opportunity to talk to each couple and understand what the dynamics are, my blanket advice is find out what strings are attached to financial support. Don't assume that, even if they paid for your brother's wedding and now it's your turn, don't assume that the strings are the same, because the circumstances could be different. 5 years before might be different than 5 years. Maybe they have more money. Maybe they did really well in the stock market and they have more money, right? And so the point is, like, you just want to really, really understand what comes along with that financial support.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's nothing.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's something. Sometimes I just want to make sure we have 50 seats for everyone from work or wherever. And so just knowing what it is. And then I also think it's super important to have a conversation with the person you're getting married to, because
Yeah.
maybe they don't feel comfortable about the strings that are attached. Maybe they feel some kind of way about it, but they don't know how to articulate it. They don't want their first fight to be over something like that. And so I think just having a really open and honest conversation, if you can't do it together, getting someone to come in the middle. You can have like this could come up in premarital counseling. You can have the counselor do it. You can have a friend who can be objective do it. You can have a mediator do it, or facilitator to facilitate the conversation. But I just think it's really important to be open about it if there's potential, because there's potential for conflict.
Yeah. And to kind of piggyback on what you just said about the strings attached, because I think one of the biggest things that I see and hear about when it comes to strings being attached is if mom and dad, or, maybe it's both sets of parents, are paying for things, all of a sudden I see oh, well, we're inviting this person, even though the couple may not know them. And that can spiral out of control. I remember with my parents, we had a combination where my husband and I paid for some things, my parents helped finance other things. And I just remember saying with my husband, before we even communicated with my parents, I said, my thing is, I don't want to meet anyone on my wedding day. Like, that's where I draw the line. That's ridiculous. Like, why? This person has clearly not been in our lives. So I think, like, what we did is created some parameters ahead of time, and kind of went in with that in a very gentle way, when we talked to them, and just said, let's get clear on this, and let's talk about, like, what are the things that you feel comfortable with, and just kind of had an open dialogue. But that's the question that I have. So oftentimes when parents are paying for things, they're like, well, we're inviting these people and that's just how it's going to be. How do you suggest couples handle that situation?
Yeah, well, first is to say, okay, right? Like that might not be ideal, and wants to say, okay, not worth
Right.
the fight.
Yeah.
I have other things to worry about and to fight about. So it's really going to depend on how much of a priority that is to you. For some people, they won't care about that. Um, I think the second thing is exactly what you said, is to set some parameters so that you still control who's there for on your wedding day, because it's still your wedding.
Mhm.
I think another option is to negotiate, right? What if instead of getting, 10 seats, you got whatever it is you can barter, you can exchange or negotiate with? Because sometimes people are just doing what they know, but there's a lot of creativity involved in wedding planning.
Mhm.
And sometimes you can say, oh, well, what about instead of this at the rehearsal dinner? We have your friends come in that night. They'll really like the
Mhm.
steakhouse or whatever it is. And then they'll get a chance. Or what about if they come to the ceremony but not to the reception, or
Mhm.
vice versa? So
Mhm.
and I've seen it work all of those ways where people still felt like as if they were a part of the process, they were included, but they weren't invited to the reception. They're invited to the ceremony. Usually, often it depends, but sometimes you're, not paying. It just depends. Sometimes there's a
Mhm.
different calculation involved for the ceremony than the reception.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think there are different ways to do it, but part of it is, even if you know your parents, you may not know your parents when they're thinking about your wedding. They may become different people. They may change. Your in-laws, you may not even know them as well, or what they're going to want when you're getting married. So some things you can plan for in advance. Maybe some things are foreseeable because maybe you do know what your parents want for you. And then thinking about what we're talking about, here are some options, right?
Mhm.
Um, no, no is a full sentence and a statement.
I love
It
that.
is.
I'm gonna put
It
that on a
is.
T-shirt. No is a full sentence.
It is.
That's
There are different
awesome.
ways you can say it,
Yeah.
but it's a full sentence. And who said that? Janne van Zandt. I saw her speak a few years ago at a Women in Power and Influence in the law, Women of Power Influence in the Law. And she said that she was one of the speakers, and she said that. So I can't take credit for that amazing statement, but it's true. No is a full
Sure.
sentence.
Sure.
And so that's the first thing. The second thing we've talked about, why? Oh, okay. And then the third thing is, a third option is, okay, well, what about this? Engaging again in some negotiation with them.
Well, and I do think too, the unique thing about a destination wedding is that we always say it's like the bouncer, like a club bouncer for your guest list. Because most people who don't have a really strong relationship with you as the couple, they're not going to want to be flung off to, Bermuda for a long weekend to spend a bunch of money and take time off of work. Like most of the people that are going to come really have an investment in your relationship, you as a person, so I do think that can actually destination weddings can be really helpful in
Mm.
keeping a guest count low. Now, after COVID, everyone's like, give me my passport and get me the hell out of here. So I think the guest list like went through the roof, but yeah, yeah, definitely. So now let's talk for a second about the couple's friends, because we've all, and this can happen at a dinner party, and at a wedding it's even worse, where it's like, well, if we invite, John, then of course we have to invite Trina, and if Trina comes, then Michael's got to come, because that would be rude if we didn't include him, and then the snowball effect happens. What do you suggest couples do in kind of figuring out what groups of friends to invite, or, do you feel like there are healthy boundaries they can set up in place ahead of time before things start to spiral?
I do. And so something that in my field of ADR, alternative dispute resolution, that we have for arbitrators, when people are deciding arbitrators and you have two people on opposing sides, is we have what's called a strike list. And a strike list means you put 10 people on the list and each side gets a strike, right? You can strike them off. And you've seen this on TV when they're selecting a jury on voir dire, and you can say, oh, we don't want this person for whatever reason. And you see them put an X on the person. So I say that somewhat as a joke, but also I think there are a few things. One, who has to be there? Meaning, I would not want to get married without these people.
Mhm.
Put those people in a group, right? Who in a perfect world would I love to be there? Put those people in a group, write their names out, right? If everyone, your spouse, your future spouse, and you may not know everyone by name, write who they are. Jenny from the Bronx, right? Um, you know, I'm still Jenny from the block. And so, and so, and then, the next list could be, they invited me to their wedding. I think I have to invite them to my wedding, right? There's so many categories, right,
So that
Jennifer?
happens all the time.
But I think that's important, like, to make lists. So who do I want to be there? And put a label on it: family, friends, coworkers, people from church, like whatever bucket they fall into.
Yeah.
And then people who invited me to their wedding that I feel like I have to invite them to my wedding. And then I think you should talk about it. You have to think about it within your budget too. What about your venue? There's certain venues that cannot accommodate more than a certain number of people. I mean, excuse me, all venues should have like a fire safety code where they can't accommodate like more than a certain amount of people. But
Right.
some venues tell you only 100 people can be here standing, right? And so if that's what you have, that's another way to manage the guest list, to say, our ceremony can only be 100 people, so we've limited that to family and really, really close friends.
Yeah.
But our reception, where we're having the reception, we can have more people. So we'd like to invite you to the reception. I think communicating what's happening is very important, because oftentimes hurt feelings come from people assuming they know why something happened.
Mhm.
Now, hurt feelings can also come from people like knowing what happened and being like, ouch, right? That could also be the case. But I think when it comes to friends, putting all the names down, figuring out who you want to be there, listening to your partner when they say, I really don't like that person, or that person gives me the creeps, or I don't want to see that person on our wedding day. And remembering that that can go both ways, meaning you might get a veto too of someone, or you might have your person vetoed.
Right. That's awesome advice. I love it. And I love how there's a theme here. We're making lists. We've got buckets. We've got buckets for the budget. We have lists for the guest list. It's so helpful, I think, to organize that. And I also think it's helpful on the onset of like before anything happens, before planning even begins, for the couple to sit down and say, I want an intimate wedding and I only want 25 people. Or I want 250 people. And oftentimes it has to do with, the couple and their culture. South Asian weddings are oftentimes hundreds of people. And, we're seeing them traveling all around the world to Cancun and, here, there, and everywhere. And it's wonderful. I think I love an Indian wedding. They're like literally my favorite. But so I think it depends on the couple, their culture, as well as what's important to them. And, some people are like, no, we're planning on like hiking to the top of a waterfall in Costa Rica and grandma is not going to be able to make it. Like, and that's okay if that's what you want. And, maybe you do a hometown reception and then she can be a part of that. But I think to have that conversation at before you even figure anything else out, like even where you're going, to figure out like, what do you envision? Do you see the big white wedding with the, like you see in the movies, or are you looking more for something that's a little smaller? So last question for you. Thank you so much for spending so much time with me. And your expert advice. What is one of the most crucial things you've seen couples kind of not negotiate on or compromise on that led to conflict? And what should have happened that didn't?
It's interesting when I think about this question, what I hear is, what is something that leads to conflict that is not limited to the wedding day, but it's a part of your relationship and marriage going forward, right? Because there are some things that will happen and, that they don't rise to the level of importance. But as we started this conversation and we talked about, communication and how people build things up and they collect things, and something that could come out of it. So something that I've seen cause conflict is this dynamic between the in-laws and basically how the person you're marrying is weighing or valuing the input from one of their parents against what you're saying,
Interesting.
because that is something that will carry into your marriage, right?
Oh yeah.
And that's something that the person who is on, I'm going to use the word losing end of whatever that negotiation is going to feel as if they are coming from behind. They're going to wonder what else will be something they have to compromise on. What else is my spouse now listening to from their parents that they will then, you know, not be on my side about? And that can impact things like when if you have kids or if you don't have kids, if it's time to buy a house, and your parents are giving you input, they maybe they're helping you financially. There are a lot of things where intentionally or advertently or inadvertently, someone else has sort of entered into you're supposed to be a twosome and someone else has entered into it, and that causes conflict.
Yeah.
And that can erode trust,
Yeah.
among other things. And so I think sometimes it may seem like a simple conflict, but about, oh, what flowers to choose? Well, me, the bride, I want roses. Well, my mom said hydrangeas would be better. Whoa, 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 whoa. Like what?
Yeah.
What? Oh, I'm just gonna go with the hydrangeas because my mom said it. She's paying for it, and I just don't want to have a fight. But you rather have a fight with me, So,
Right.
so I think sometimes just thinking a few steps ahead about, what is if I take this decision, if I make this decision or take this step, um, what is the bigger picture? What am I signaling to my spouse?
Yeah.
What am I signaling to the person that I'm saying I want to come together in this way? And then together we are the new team
Mhm.
that's moving forward. And
Yeah.
so something to be aware of is
Yeah.
how some of those decisions, how they are reflective of maybe some things you might need to think about
Yeah.
going forward, that maybe that worked before, but and maybe that would work now. I don't know. Every couple is different. Maybe someone appreciates not having to make every decision for or their spouse. So I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm just saying
Right.
that that's a place where I have seen conflict, and I've seen people, even when they're together for decades or months, say, even on my wedding day, his mom said, and I'm like, whoa, like, so they've been
Yeah.
holding it, they've been aware of it, and it's something that they're comparing, behavior against, and they continue to do that throughout the course
Yeah.
of the relationship. So that's something to be aware of.
Yeah.
And if you can articulate it, sometimes people don't know what it is that's driving them crazy. Right.
Yeah.
They don't know. They're like, oh, I just don't like it. But they can't really identify what it is. But if you can identify what it is, then you should talk about it, because if you can identify it, then you can try to resolve it. And going back to where we started, if you have an idea, like a suggestion on how to resolve it, like we talked about the car and moving it 5 inches, I don't mind you checking in with your parents about these big decisions. They helped you with big decisions your whole life before
Mhm.
you knew me, you know, but now I'm here.
Mhm.
And I don't want to feel like I'm the second person, the third person that you talk to about this. I want to be, the first person, or I want to make sure that I'm a part of that conversation. So just kind of identifying what it is. Is it being left out? Is it being disregarded? There are many, again, I have tons of synonyms, and different ways that we can describe it,
Yeah.
but just taking a moment to think about what it is, and I like the word you used earlier, Jennifer, when you were talking about, being gentle and how you talk to,
Mhm.
people about ideas about the wedding. And
Yeah.
I think it's very easy to fall into familiar communication patterns of people that right? Like you just have this cadence and that's what you do. But when there's a conflict, sometimes what you have to think about is slowing things down so that you can really pinpoint what the pressure points are, or what it is, and then say, this is how I feel, because when you leave me out, I feel underappreciated. and I don't want to feel underappreciated. So, what I'm asking you to do going forward, because we can't go backwards, not how life works, is to include me in these types of discussions earlier.
Mhm. I'd love that. I read a book when I was um, pregnant with my first child, and it was called, I think it was The Baby Whisperer. I don't know, some English lady that wrote the book, but one of the things that she said that applied to parenting, but I'm applying it to everything, is she said, start as you mean to go on. Meaning, if you're fine with having a 35-minute routine getting your child to bed every night, then do that. But if you're one of those where you are going to put baby in the bed and walk away and that's how you want to do it, that's how you need to start. And I think that applies to so many things. I mean, to what you're saying, it's like if you start that way by saying, hey, I appreciate that these people raised you, that these people helped you with every major decision in your life, and they were your sounding board. Well, now I'm your sounding board or wanna be. And, let's start this as we mean to go on because if you don't, then it's almost like, yeah, you can't move backwards, but that stuff plants seeds and there's anger and there's stuff that baggage you're dragging along into the future. And, that can really impact people. Well, Damali, thank you so much. This has been like just the greatest conversation. I really appreciate your time. It's been wonderful.
It's been delightful for me too, Jennifer. You make me want to have a destination wedding now. We are a couple years shy of our 20th wedding anniversary,
You
so
have vow
maybe we can have
renewal.
we have one every 5 years
Oh
actually.
my God, I
The
love
first one,
that.
yeah, the fifth was in Costa Rica, the 10th was in New York, and the 15th was in Florence in Italy.
Ooh,
So
okay. So do you
yeah.
have any plans for 20 then? Have you started thinking about it?
I've always wanted to go to the Amalfi Coast, so I recognize it's Italy again, but it's this different Italy. It's the
Oh
Amalfi
yeah,
Coast.
it's the Amalfi Coast. I mean, come on. That's actually it's so funny that you say that because my husband and I we're creeping in on 20 also, and I've already started my list, and I'm like Amalfi Coast. We want to go to Ravello. We're like, okay, we're gonna go here. We want to go to Switzerland, so we've already started kind of the bucket list of the things I want to do, the things he wants to do. So yeah, definitely love that. Well, thank you so much, Damali. And if any of you want to follow Damali, you can go to her website online, damalipeterman.com, and her social media handle is Damali Peterman. And if you want to follow, like, subscribe, comment on our podcast, please do so. We'd love to hear from you. Our email address is info@destinationido. Our website is destinationido.com and our social media handle is @destinationido. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.